what I'd like to do tonight is give you some background on the causes of wrongful conviction, introduce you to some folks around the country through the PowerPoint presentation, other people who've been wrongly convicted, so that you can have real human stories relating to these causes and these consequences. But mostly, it's just an introduction to Scott Hornoff, who is the person that you're here to hear from tonight. And Scott's going to tell you his story, his personal story of having been wrongly convicted of murder and having been exonerated. So our country just the week before last won its 300th exoneration by DNA evidence. A young man named Chris Thibodeau down in New Orleans, Louisiana, spent 18 years on death row and just came home a couple of weeks ago. He was the 300th exoneree. What that means, a DNA exoneration, what that means is that somebody who's in prison for something they didn't do is able to get access to physical evidence from the crime scene, evidence that was collected at the time of the crime, maybe 10, 15, 20 years earlier, get that evidence tested for the DNA of the actual perpetrator. And what that's done so far is exonerate 300 people, but also in 50% of those cases, the DNA evidence that's exonerated the innocent person has actually identified the true perpetrator as well. So we've been able to bring closure to and justice to crime victims through that DNA testing process as well, which in my view and in Scott's view is really, really important. You can see these 300 people who were exonerated as a result of DNA evidence. The average time that they spent in prison wrongly was 13 years, but some of them spent as many as 20, 25, 30, even 35 years. There's a man named Barry Barnes out of Florida who spent 35 years in prison for a rape that he didn't commit. Combined, more than 3,000 years by these 300 individuals alone. But maybe one of the most important things for you all to take home tonight is that DNA evidence is available in only about 5% or less of all post-conviction cases. So these 300 people who've been exonerated by DNA evidence really are the lucky ones. The vast majority of people do not have the benefit of DNA evidence in their cases. And to find those people and identify them and free them, like was done in Scott's case or in my mom's own case, really, frankly, close to impossible, and most of those people will never be able to right the wrongs that happened in those cases. And that's one of the things we'll talk about tonight is the importance of really preventing these things on the front end, right? Getting on the front end and improving the way that our system delivers justice and makes sure that we get the right people in prison and not the wrong people. I get asked a lot about, how many people may be wrongly imprisoned. We don't know the answer to that. There's 2.6 million people in prison in the country. Is that right? 2.6. The most conservative and probably credible research to date puts the error rate at about 3 to 5%, but that's only in felony murders and rapes. Nobody's looking at numbers in lesser felonies or misdemeanors, which is the larger number of people in prison. I can tell you that I come from the state of Virginia, and we had so many exonerations in Virginia that the governor ordered an audit of our crime lab, and what we discovered in Virginia was that we had a 9% error rate in all rapes and murders coming out of the crime lab. And so, I think even with a 1% error rate, right, we're talking about a human system that's certainly going to have some rate of error. Even with a 1% error rate, we're talking about tens of thousands of people who are likely wrongly imprisoned. At a 10% error rate, which is probably a lot more likely, we're talking about a lot of people. So this is a very important issue. But the thing that I like to talk about maybe the most is that it's important not just to innocent people in prison and their family members, and I can say that with authenticity because of my personal experience, but really it's important to all of us, right? Because when the wrong person goes to prison, the right person doesn't. And what that means is that we have a public safety issue because the actual perpetrator hasn't been removed from the streets. We have a real justice issue with respect to crime victims, right, who are doubly and sometimes even triply harmed when the wrong person goes to prison and they only discover it 10, 15, 20 years later and are forced to relive the situation all over again, either because their case goes on as a cold case or because they finally catch the perpetrator that many years later. You know, I also think it's a very important issue to law enforcement officials, because obviously people in law enforcement want to get the right person, and they want to catch the right person, and they want to deliver that service to crime victims. And so, you know, there's that issue as well. And then, you know, there's a taxpayer dollars issue as well, right? Because this is a system that we fund and that we want to work for us. And so I say these things because this is something I've been talking about for a number of years. It's also now what I'm doing in my new job, which is working with other criminal justice stakeholders across the system to identify, you know, those shared interests, which at the end of the day is making sure that the right person's in prison and not the wrong person. DNA evidence, in addition to exonerating 300 people so far and identifying close to 150 actual perpetrators out of those cases, the other thing it's enabled us to do is to identify, like across those cases of wrongful conviction, what have been the causes? Like, what do we see come up over and over in these cases? And I can tell you, having worked on cases now for about 20 years, we really do see patterns to them. And it's been really important for us to understand what the causes are, so that we can start working with law enforcement and others to figure out, you know, how do we get on the front end and to improve them, to prevent them from happening in the first place. The single largest cause of wrongful convictions is mistaken eyewitness identification. And there's two reasons that it's the single largest cause. One, because most cases involve some witness who has information about the crime. Maybe it's a witness to the crime, maybe it's the crime victim. And so you see it in a large percentage of cases. But the other reason that it is a major cause of wrongful conviction is that eyewitness identification is fallible. And the reason it's fallible is not because anybody's doing anything wrong, but because our memory doesn't work like a tape recorder. It isn't as perfect as we think that it is. There's a lot of subjective stuff that goes on when we're trying to remember what somebody looked like or what happened. And so what we find is crime victims, their memory of the crime, even I mean the crime victims, the eyewitnesses, their memory of the crime might be less than perfect, and so there's real work that needs to be done in making sure that that evidence is preserved and reported back as perfectly as possible. But also circumstances of crime, right? You know, there's scary things, there are dark things, there are things that involve guns or knives or people who are trying to hurt you, and we've discovered that the chemistry of the brain, the neuroscience, if you will, actually affects the way that we take in information and report information back out because of all of the flood of hormones and things that are going on in scary situations. And so one of the things that we're doing now with law enforcement officials across the country, there have been some really terrific things coming out of certain departments and officials in the states of North Carolina and Wisconsin and Ohio and New Jersey, where they are working to perfect or improve and perfect the way that they bring the witnesses in and the way that they retract or preserve those memories so that they increase the reliability of the identification. And that's, you know, obviously important to us all. False confessions. One that people find it really, really difficult to believe, but once you start working in these cases, you understand that it happens far more often than we want to believe. 25% of the 300 DNA exonerations involved false confessions. You know, these things, if you ever talk to somebody who has incriminated him or herself wrongly, you can start to understand how it happens. And it's really, especially with an innocent person who goes into a police department to assist with a crime, they have nothing to hide. They actually think that they're helping. They might be in a grief-stricken state. There might be something else that's going on. They can easily get turned around. There are psychological tactics that are used. Sometimes there are, you know, threats that are used, not the kind of things we know from decades ago, but threats of a more severe punishment, that kind of thing that can cause people to think that it's in their best interest to actually give something up, to maybe start to meet the law enforcement in the middle and to compromise themselves. And we'll talk about some of those cases, but it's a very real problem. And one of the things we're seeing now is that the electronic recording of interrogations from beginning to end really helps to nullify this problem. One, it allows juries to see what actually goes on in the interrogation room, which is good not just for an innocent person who may have been led to falsely confess, but also for law enforcement, right? Because what we found is it's a lot easier for I mean, if you get the guilty person on tape confessing, then the jury gets to see that as well. And we now have something like, more than 500 law enforcement departments across the country that are doing electronic recording of interrogations, and they've found that that's really helped them seal the deal in their casework. Forensic evidence. This is a really complex one. What we have found in DNA, right, is that DNA evidence, because it really grew up as a science out of the science lab, has a scientific ability to identify, any number of us, any one of us in the room. It can actually tell, you can actually say who was at the crime and who wasn't. And that's been terrific. But what it's also done is shed some light on the other forensic evidence that we've been using for years, which doesn't have that same capacity. It doesn't mean that evidence, fingerprint evidence or blood evidence or hair evidence or fiber evidence or ballistic evidence, those things certainly are investigative tools that help us understand what happened at a crime and can help maybe lead us to the actual perpetrator, but they don't have the ability to identify like DNA evidence. And so it's helping us to rethink what really proves a case and what doesn't. And some of the things that we're working on across the country now are standardizing the way that people handle and testify about forensic evidence, making sure that everyone has really been schooled in it, and that labs are accredited and that kind of thing. But you can see 65% of the 300 DNA exonerations involved some faulty evidence. There was faulty evidence in Scott's case. There was faulty forensic evidence in my mom's case. It's a very real problem, and it's something that it's more complex to work on, but nationally there are now working groups. The federal government is sponsoring a number of things aimed at trying to just improve forensic evidence across the country in all of the states. Snitch testimony. We see it in almost every wrongful conviction, and my thought on that is when you don't have a really good case, maybe through solid physical evidence or something else, a snitch can be the evidence that gets brought to court because it may be the only thing that someone has. But what we find is that snitches are people who are looking for a deal. They're looking to cut a deal in exchange for their testimony in court, and so they offer information up with that expectation. And I've worked with a number of prosecutors now who've said, we won't do that again, or we certainly won't do it as the only evidence, because unfortunately it's not reliable evidence. It's usually not corroborated, and it is another major factor of wrongful convictions. And finally, my favorite of the day is, the lawyers. And I can say this because I am one. The reality is, law is a game. And lawyers, the goal is to win the case. And what that does often is dilute, if not, certainly dilute the goal of getting to the truth. And what we find is a lot of gamesmanship that causes both prosecuting attorneys and defense attorneys to not always put on the best evidence, right? Or to pursue cases when the evidence doesn't support the case. And this has been a much harder group for us to work with. We're actually doing really terrific work, I think, with police agencies and crime victims and crime labs across the country. But the lawyers are, they're pretty entrenched in the way they do business, and but they are also a leading cause of wrongful conviction. So this is Kirk Bloodsworth from your own state of Maryland. Does anybody here know Kirk? They know of Kirk, had a chance to hear him speak? Yeah, Kirk's terrific. Kirk he was convicted of capital rape and murder and was sent to death row for the rape and murder of a child in Maryland. His case, kind of a classic case of mistaken eyewitness identification. There were some children and some other people near the scene of the crime that described the person they believed to be the perpetrator. There was a composite sketch made by them. The composite sketch went out on the news. This was a very high profile and horrific crime. The composite sketch goes out on the news, and someone calls in and says, well, that looks like this young man in my neighborhood, Kirk Bloodsworth. They bring Kirk in. The young witnesses identify Kirk as the perpetrator, and frankly, that was pretty much the end of his case. Sadly, in Kirk's case, well, among other things, that the actual perpetrator in the case, when the DNA evidence was tested and it demonstrated that Kirk was not the perpetrator of the crime, it also demonstrated who was the perpetrator of the crime, who had gone on to rape and murder another child in Maryland, you know, obviously, which is that double or triple or quadruple tragedy that we're talking about. Kirk's case has been, was very high profile because he was the first person to be exonerated off death row. He also then worked with Congress very closely with both Senator Hatch from Utah and Senator Leahy from Vermont to pass the Innocence Protection Act in 2004, sorry. And as part of that, 2006, as part of that, the federal government now has set aside funds to go back and test evidence in old cases where testing has never been done, and that's the Kirk Bloodsworth DNA testing program. It's a really terrific program. There is about a couple of $1 million now that goes out to state forensic labs, prosecutors' offices, police departments to do this testing in these old cases for dual means, right, to make sure that the wrong person isn't in prison, and then hopefully to identify the right person if that's the case. If you ever have a chance to hear Kirk speak, he's amazing, and you should take the opportunity. This is also another famous case and a famous couple. This involves a young college student from North Carolina who suffered a really awful rape that she survived. Her name is Jennifer Thompson. She's a very close friend of mine. Jennifer decided through the course of her 4-hour rape at knife point that she would live to put her perpetrator behind bars, and went to the police station immediately following her rape. Well, let me step back. Because she vowed to live through her rape and to identify her perpetrator, she spent her rape memorizing the face of her perpetrator, and she was actually able to get her perpetrator to turn on the light and to go into the kitchen and fix her a glass of water, and so she really was certain that she knew what her perpetrator looked like. And she went down to the police station. They said, "Jennifer, can you identify this guy?" She said, "Absolutely. His face is burned into my brain. I can absolutely remember him." She did a composite sketch, and if you ever hear Jennifer talk, she'll tell you about what a composite sketch involves. You know, she had like 200 eyebrows to choose from, 200 pairs of eyes, 200 noses, whatever. She did the best that she could. She creates a composite sketch. It goes out. A woman calls in and says, that looks like my no-good neighbor's son, Ronald Cotton. They bring Ronald Cotton in. Jennifer says, "Absolutely, that's the guy." 11 years later, Ronald finally gets DNA testing done. It turns out he's not the guy, and the guy that actually raped Jennifer was a man named Bobby Poole, who went on to rape 6 other women in her town before being caught. He actually went to prison and bragged about raping Jennifer, and it still took years for Ronald to get the testing that he needed to prove his innocence. They have now written a book together, which will probably become a major movie. They travel the world speaking together. They have amazing stories, and I got to say that in both Kirk's case and in Ron's case, the physical evidence was really difficult to find. In Kirk's case, they spent years looking for physical evidence. They were told over and over and over that it was no longer there, that the child's clothing, that the rape kit were gone. One day, the attorneys who were now working on his case, a decade after the fact, happened to be in the courtroom, and the now clerk of the trial judge came up to them and said, "Here you're looking for evidence in the Kirk Bloodsworth case. The judge has this bag of stuff in a closet in his chambers. It might be worth looking at." And sure enough, a decade later, they found the rape kit, the clothing, and all of that in the judge's chambers. In Ronald's case, they went to destroy the evidence as part of a kind of typical destruction policy, but the lead detective in the case had always believed that it was Bobby Poole who raped Jennifer. Jennifer was just insistent that it was Ronald Cotton. And so when the evidence got thrown out, he actually went and retrieved it and kept it in his desk drawer, just in case it might ever be of value. The point of all of that is even if there's DNA evidence in the case, sometimes we have real trouble finding it, locating it, and of course there are issues with preservation and other things that really there shouldn't be. I talked a little bit about false confessions. Christopher Ochoa out of Texas falsely confessed to a murder he didn't commit after being threatened repeatedly with the death penalty. Chris was so scared of the death penalty that even later after the actual perpetrator had written numerous letters to then Governor Bush and to the police, and DNA testing had been done. Christopher didn't want to admit that he was innocent because he feared that it would, that somehow he would still end up being executed. But ultimately, the Innocence Project in Wisconsin was able to convince him to get that DNA testing done. The DNA testing was done. The actual purpose, the DNA testing, the evidence from the rape matched the person who'd been confessing to the crime by then for about 7 years, and Christopher was released, and he's now a lawyer in Wisconsin, a really amazing young man. Curtis McCarty, one of my favorite people in the world. Curtis his is a unique story because this doesn't happen all the time, but do any of you know the case, the story of Joyce Gilchrist out of Oklahoma? She was a medical examiner who falsified evidence in tens, if not 20s, more tens of cases. She ultimately admitted to this, of making up evidence, and so he was one of many people who were exonerated as the result of her misconduct. But he spent 22 years in prison in Oklahoma. 19 of those years were on death row, which in Oklahoma is underground. So he was never outside for all of those 19 years. He's an amazing person, beautiful soul, incredible speaker, a poet, a photographer. Look him up if you ever have a chance. Stephen Barnes just came home a couple of years ago after 20 years in prison. His case was, he was convicted on some of that fallible forensic evidence, fiber evidence, blood evidence, hair evidence, the kind of stuff that we now know doesn't serve to actually identify people like we hoped that it did. He was ultimately exonerated by DNA testing. In his case, the police have reopened the investigation. It is now a cold case, and they're looking for the actual perpetrator. But it's been 25 years. It's much harder now to find him. And then there's my mom, Beverly Monroe. So my mom is an exoneree from Virginia. She was convicted of murder for the suicide death of her then boyfriend. In that case, we'll never really quite know exactly how it all got started because the local police who came in and investigated the crime determined that it was a suicide. The medical examiner, both the local medical examiner and the state medical examiner who conducted the autopsy, concluded that it was a suicide. There was a state police investigator who decided that it must be something else, and kind of unilaterally took up an investigation separate from the local authorities. And within just a couple of months, my mom was charged with first-degree murder, and she was convicted. It was kind of a crazy case. The jury, even though it was a first-degree murder conviction, the jury came back with the minimum sentence of 22 years. Jurors later weren't sure how they felt. They felt like, they didn't know. Did she do it? Did she not do it? If it was a murder, was it a suicide? If it was a murder, they thought she probably did, but they weren't sure. Maybe it was a suicide. They gave her the lightest sentence they could. It took us 13 years to overturn her conviction, and the federal court that overturned her conviction called the case a monument to prosecutorial mishandling because that evidence of suicide was there all along. I mean, it had come out of the forensic lab, it had come out of the chief medical examiner's office, but the jurors never heard about it, and we uncovered it, only 7 years after her trial. And then, of course, when we were able to bring it to light, that made the difference in her case. But the fact that, that we had to do that is troubling. And I will say, and Scott will tell you some of this, a lot of times, when in many, many cases, these cases get overturned because there's one person, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's somebody in the community, maybe it's a police officer who always had their doubts, maybe it's a crime victim. Crime victims now are advocating in cases where they believe that the wrong person went to prison. But the system doesn't seem to fix itself. It's really, really difficult to force those courtroom doors back open and to get a court to hear in a post-conviction 10, 15, 20 years after somebody's been convicted, to get them to even listen to the possibility that somebody's innocent, much less come up with the kind of evidence that a court is willing to exonerate on. And so often it's somebody like myself or somebody like Scott or somebody in Scott's family that's doing this work. And so, again, that preventive piece, right, that piece that will enable us to do better work on the front end during the investigation of our cases is really important, because the court system isn't really equipped to overturn these cases. The statutes don't exist. The procedural barriers are too high. The evidentiary standards are too high. And so, those of you who are going to go off and become law enforcement officials or lawyers, whatever it is that you're going to do, really bear in mind it's a human system. It's a fallible system because it's a human system. There is room for mistake at every single level, so it's really important to start concentrating on how do we prevent them from happening in the first place. And so I would say now, just help me in joining and welcoming Scott, because you're going to hear a very real story about how it did go wrong and how important it is to get it right. So, Scott Hornoff, please.
Good evening. I want to thank Elizabeth Webster from the New York Innocence Project and Jennifer Van Corey from the college for giving me this opportunity to join you tonight, and I want to thank all of you for coming out. Obviously, I think it's a really important topic, and for you to give me your time, I think that you think that as well. I want to thank Katie for letting me share the floor with her. I haven't given a guest lecture in a few years. I recently returned from my 5th mission working in Afghanistan, and it's really good to get back into it. Everything that Katie said to you, she could probably go on for 2 or 3 hours giving you more information about it. And I think I could probably share a couple hours of my story with you too. I don't have that much time, so I'll give you the abbreviated version, but if you have any questions during my talk, nothing is off limits. You can ask me anything. And I want to thank the criminal justice professionals and future professionals who are here tonight, because obviously this is something you're going to be dealing with throughout your career, whether you're a police officer, a defense attorney, a prosecutor, a judge, or if you become an investigative journalist. This is very important stuff. It's also important for practically everybody, because everybody's a potential juror. And I think there's probably not too many jobs more important that you will have if you're selected as a juror than potentially sending somebody to prison for the rest of their life. So you really want to pay attention if you're selected. As Katie said, there's been 300 exonerations through DNA, and each one has a tragic and unique story. Most of the individuals were young black men when they went to prison. A great disproportionate number. And most of them were in prison because of faulty testimony or eyewitnesses who thought they saw one thing and actually it was another. My case is also unique because I was a young, white, educated, middle-class cop. So I think I'm a pretty good example that if it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody. It can happen to one of you too. I'd like to see, by a show of hands, has anybody here ever been accused of something you didn't do? Whether it's borrowing your sister's clothes, your dad's tools, breaking something, cheating on a test. I see everybody's raising their hands. So we all have something in common. Now just imagine being accused of one of the most horrendous things you could ever be accused of: murder. I think the only thing that somebody could accuse me of that would have affected me more would have been hurting a child. When I was in detectives, my specialty was investigating that crime. And as bad as being charged with murder, I think that one probably would have affected me even greater. I'm going to give you a little bit of background of how I became a police officer and my years on the force. Again, if you have any questions on the topic I'm covering, feel free to raise your hands. Back in 1975, before most of you were born, I was 12 years old, and my brother was invited to attend the Rhode Island Municipal Police Training Academy. Back then, you didn't have to take a test. You didn't have to go through a physical or an oral board. It was basically if you knew somebody and they vouched for you, you would get a phone call, and he did. In order for him to get in shape for the academy, he started jogging. I had no interest in jogging. I was 12 years old. I was riding dirt bikes and playing hockey. And he basically forced me to start jogging with him. I did have an interest in his job, and I had an interest in the police academy. And the more we jogged together, the more interested I became in the job. It sounded pretty cool to me. You basically weren't stuck behind a desk 8 hours a day. You were your own boss, and you were helping people. And even though it sounds kind of corny, it really did appeal to me. When I was 18 years old, I put on a suit and tie and I visited my city's police department and a couple neighboring police departments to inquire how I could become a cop. And I was told at each one of them that I had to look in the newspaper for an advertisement, And that was basically how it was going to be. So I got tired of waiting, and in the meantime, I went through the process, the testing to become a Marine, and I had the pen in my hand, and I did all this without my parents' knowledge. I went back, I decided to talk to my mom and dad about it first. And when I got back to the house, my mom showed me an ad in the paper where the Warwick Police, my brother's department, was accepting applications. So I went down, I filled out an application, and I was put on the waiting list. I passed the test, and I was sent to the academy. I celebrated my 21st birthday in the police academy. I was really excited. My brother had continually told me stories. It really sounded like a great job for me. I did really well in the police academy. I graduated second in my class. I was put in undercover when I graduated, and I actually worked for my brother. I worked in there for a year, and from there, everybody goes to third shift uniform patrol. I went to the third shift uniform after that, and then to tactical patrol, and I was loving it. I enrolled in college, like all of you. I was dating, I was riding my motorcycle. I was loving it. It was the 80s, and police work was a great job. In 1988, we had a little 4-year-old boy go missing in Buttonwood City Park, and our whole department was out looking for him. We called in other departments, volunteers, and it took a member of the city next to us, a member of the police department dive team, to find this little boy in a couple feet of water. And if any of you are going to be police officers, you know that you don't want somebody else doing your job. We didn't have a dive team, so we decided to start one because of that incident, because of that tragedy. I was scared to death of the water. In 1975, back when I was 12, Jaws came out, and I wanted nothing to do with the water. But I felt like it was another way to give back to the community, and it was also a way for me to face my fear of the water. So I went through the class with them, and I was certified with probably 15 or 20 other guys. We really enjoyed the time. We would go out and do dive training, and we actually trained other police departments. I figured most of the time I would be diving in the daytime in fresh water, so there was no fear of sharks. I ended up doing most of my dives after working second shift in the ocean, and it was dark and cold, but it was really cool. I was also continuing to jog at this time, and my brother and I were putting on fundraisers for the Rhode Island Special Olympics, and we were also doing a yearly run, a 10-mile run in Narragansett, Rhode Island, called the Blessing of the Fleet Road Race. So between that, in college, in Special Olympics, in work, I was pretty busy. I also met a girl who had moved in 2 houses away from me with her dad, and we started dating. And even though I was too young, and I look back now, I wasn't ready for a serious relationship, but a lot of my partners were getting married and getting a house, and I kind of felt like it was the next step in maturity, or, you know, the next step in, you know, just moving on with your life. We got engaged a year later, and we married 6 months after that. So I was pretty busy. About a year into my marriage, I told my wife that I really wasn't happy. I asked her if she would go through counseling with me, and she refused, and I tried a couple other different avenues that she wasn't really interested in. So I started concentrating on my work. I was going out with the guys after work at this point because I really didn't want to go home. I had some indiscretions. I was unfaithful to my wife. It's something I'm not proud of, but it's part of my story, and it's something I feel I need to share with you. In 1989, I was visiting the Alpine Ski and Sports Dive Shop. They're the ones who certified us in scuba diving, and they also would fill our tanks for free. We got some really good deals from them as far as being on the dive team. I mentioned to the guys there that I was going to be running in the road race, and I invited them to go to the Coast Guard House, which is it was an oceanfront restaurant nightclub until this last storm pretty much demolished it. But I invited them to meet me there. I was going to be there with my brothers after the road race. And one of the girls who worked at Alpine Ski and Sports, Vicky Cushman, I don't remember inviting her there, but she's the one that showed up. And I was up on the upper deck with my brothers having a beer and just relaxing after the race. It was a beautiful summer night. And I felt a tap on the shoulder, and I looked, and it was Vicky. And I said, "What are you doing here?" Because I didn't remember inviting her. And she said, "Well, I'm here to see you." Long story short, she invited me to go back to her apartment. She wanted to give me a ride home. I refused. I went home with my brother that night. But shortly after that, I did get together with Vicky, and I was unfaithful with my wife. As soon as it happened, I realized it was a mistake, and I said, "Vicky, we just need to be friends." She was dating quite a few other people, and she didn't really seem all that upset about it. Later, there would be testimony saying that she had all these ideas that I was going to run away with her and get married. She never expressed that to me. About 2 weeks later, we had a horrific triple murder in our city. And unfortunately, let me jump back. 2 weeks after that, I went to a police officer's summer party, and there was a lot of drinking going on, a lot of food. All the cops were there. The cops were actually called because of the noise complaint. I got a ride there from my brother, and he actually took me home. And when I woke up the next morning, it was by a phone call from my brother. And he said there was a murder on Maple Street last night. I was severely hungover. My throat was dry. My head was pounding. And I said, "Yes, so?" And he said, "Well, you know who lives on Maple Street?" Vicky lived above the Alpine Ski and Sports offices on Maple Street. But Maple Street is a split street. Half of it is businesses, half of it is residential. And there's got to be 200 people who live on that street. So I was thinking, what are the odds? At this time, I was working second shift detectives. And I really didn't think too much about it at the time. I didn't watch the news. I basically was recovering that day, just drinking water and taking aspirin. I took a shower and I went to work. And when I got into work, I remember yelling across the conference room to another daytime detective, Mike Babula, and I said, "Mike, who was murdered last night?" And I still remember as clear as if it happened just a minute ago. He put his thumb and his finger to the bridge of his nose and tilted his head back and closed his eyes and said, "Victoria Cushman." I remember dropping into my chair because it was the first time I'd ever known anybody who had been murdered. I'd seen a lot of bad crimes. I'd investigated a lot of horrific crime scenes. But this was the first time that I'd ever, known anybody who had been murdered. And so I got up and I went into the detectives conference room. It's where the major crime unit would gather anytime something serious had happened. I wanted to see if they had caught the person, if there was anything I could do. And I was met by the detective sergeant at the door, and he said, "We'll be with you in a minute," and which kind of made me take a step back. I figured being on the police dive team and knowing Vicky that I would be questioned, but I thought all the guys on the dive team would be questioned. So I called my brother and I said, "You were right, it was Vicky who was murdered." And a short time later, I was called into the detective captain's room, and the door was closed, and he was in there with the detective lieutenant, and they had a tape recorder on the desk. And he gave me a piece of paper and told me to read it. And I started reading it, and it was my rights as a suspect in the murder of Vicky, which really hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. Not only had I just learned that a friend had been murdered, now I'm being accused of it. And I can't tell you what was going through my head. I was really numb. I read my rights out loud. I remember hearing the spinning of the tape recorder. I knew that they were tape recording it. And after I finished reading them and I agreed to cooperate, they asked me if I knew Vicky, and I said yes. I knew her very well from the dive shop, and I explained my relationship with her. I didn't say that I had been intimate with her because I'd never seen a tape-recorded interrogation before. It's something that we didn't do. And I was a little concerned because I knew some of the tricks that we were allowed to do in order to get somebody to confess, and I was afraid that they were going to play that tape recording for my wife and that she was going to get upset and she was going to say something that wasn't true and implicate me in something I didn't do. So when they said, "Were you just a friend? Was there anything more?" I repeated, "We were very good friends." I didn't say, "No, we didn't have sex." I didn't say, "Yes, we did." What I did say was, "Would a polygraph help?" And they turned off the tape recorder and said yes. So they set up a polygraph with our police department's polygraph examiner. Eddie Pierce was a good guy, but he wasn't very competent as a polygraph examiner. My brother had told me about a case where he had actually said that somebody was truthful and not a rapist, and the guy turned out to be the rapist. I had also just recently written his son a ticket for a traffic accident, and he was furious about it. So I was a little concerned about taking one from him, but I was innocent. I had taken a polygraph before when I had been accused of taking a gold chain off somebody I arrested. So I felt like, sure, I'll take it. When I was going through the polygraph pre-examination interview, I told Eddie that I had been intimate with Vicky, and I explained to him why I hadn't been forthcoming with the tape recorder. He basically said he would have done the same thing. I took the test, I passed it, I went back into the captain's office. He said I was no longer a suspect. He gave me back my gun. He said, "Take the night off, you're probably going to be working on the case at some point." I'm not really sure what the major crime unit did in Vicky's case. They were a very hush-hush unit. They didn't share a lot of information with the plain detectives. They kind of looked down on us. So now I'm at that point 2 weeks later from Vicky's murder. We had a triple murder in our city. A mom and her 2 young daughters were brutally murdered, and every detective was put on that case. And Vicky's case quickly went to a back burner. We quickly arrested a 15-year-old for the murder of Mrs. Heaton and her 2 young daughters, and he actually confessed to a murder 2 years prior when he was 13. So all the detectives and all the police officers, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves for solving that and for getting him off the street. But I also remember Mr. Cushman coming into the police station probably once every 2 weeks asking for an update about his daughter and her case. And I remember hearing the major crime unit guys saying, "Well, you deal with him this time. Well, you get rid of him this time. Tell him something. Just make him go away." And I really felt bad about it. It was his daughter who had been murdered, and you know, no parent is supposed to bury their child. You've heard that before, and I was heartbroken for him. And I wasn't allowed to work on the case. None of us were. It was a major crime unit case, and we really didn't know what was happening, if anything. Supposedly they were following leads. I didn't know it, but the major crime unit wanted to question me again. I would have gladly spoken with them. I would have taken another polygraph. They could have taken my hair, my blood, anything. But the detective captain and lieutenant at the time were trying to block them from doing it, basically saying the investigation's over. So they went to the Rhode Island State Police and said, "We think Scott Hornoff killed Vicky Cushman." This was in 1991, the end of 91, the beginning of 92. The next time I heard about it was when there was a knock on the door in May of 1992, and it was 2 Providence Journal newspaper reporters. I opened the door and they said, "Do you have any comment about being the chief suspect in the Victoria Cushman murder investigation?" And this was just a second sledgehammer to the gut. I thought the investigation was over as far as I was concerned, and here it was coming back. I called the commander's office. Well, I told them I had no comment, and I shut the door. I called the commander's office. The commander verified that the state police had taken over the investigation. I went up to my wife's work. I said, I'm going to lose you one of two ways. Either I'm going to be accused and convicted of something I didn't do, or you're going to divorce me because I was unfaithful to you. And she said, well, we'll get through with this, and then we'll deal with that later. I had a lot of support from my family. The next day, it was plastered across the front page. I continued going to work. Unbeknownst to me, everybody in the police department was being questioned by the state police, and even my friends, they had been threatened with their jobs. If they told me what was going on, they would lose their jobs. So I was the only one who didn't know. So looking back, I can see, you know, how I was being treated a little differently in there, but that's all right. After a while, it got to a point where I was so isolated that I went out on stress, and I was placed on administrative sick leave while the process was going through what it had to go through. On one hand, I was fairly confident that I was going to be cleared of this, and I had hopes that the state police were going to do their job. My brother had worked with one of the state police detectives who was handling it, and he said he seemed to be a pretty good guy. They called me in for an interrogation. I went down. My lawyer couldn't make it. He had a prior engagement. I said, Joel, it's fine. I'll go by myself. I'm innocent. They'll see that I'm innocent. You know, I should know better. I'm a cop. But I was innocent, so I wanted them to see that so that they could focus on finding the true killer. I don't know how long the interrogation lasted, maybe 6 or 8 hours. And they said anytime I wanted them to stop the tape recorder just to make this motion but not say anything. And they also told me when the tape recorder wasn't being played that if I didn't remember something to take my best guess. This got to be a running joke with everybody else who was interviewed, which is basically everybody on the police department, everybody who was at the party the night that she was murdered, as well as their wives, because everybody was told to take their best guess. I did. And I went down for a second interrogation, and my wife and my brother, they did too. I said, I will take a polygraph, I'll take a voice stress analysis, sodium pentothal, take my hair, take my blood, which they ended up doing. There were no witnesses linking me to Vicky's murder. There was no evidence linking me to Vicky's murder. The only thing that happened was after my brother dropped me off from the party, I went back to the party because I had forgotten some cassette tapes and I had forgotten my cooler. So I went back to the party to retrieve those and to see who had gotten off second shift and who was there to maybe hang out with them. When I got back to the party and I stepped out of the car, I don't know if any of you have ever had a few drinks, but if you have and you've ever stood up quickly, if you get that sudden rush in your head and you get dizzy, that's what happened to me. So I went walking up to the backyard, and I was feeling the effects. I shouldn't have been driving. That's another lesson tonight that I want to impart to you. I shouldn't have been driving, but I was. It was stupid. I didn't see anybody from second shift to really hang out with, so I grabbed my stuff and I left. And that's really all they had, besides me looking highly intoxicated or a little strange, according to some of the testimony. Right before they sent this to the grand jury, we found out through looking at the crime scene photos that Vicky was wearing a Braxton Hicks dental mouth guard. It's something that people wear at night to keep from grinding their teeth. And the prosecution's whole case was that I went to Vicky's apartment that night after the party. I got into an argument with her because she threatened to tell my wife about our relationship, and I killed her with a 17-pound fire extinguisher. And I said to my attorney, and he agreed, Vicky didn't have an argument with anybody, and if she had this big crush on me, she wasn't going to be wearing the dental mouth guard. She would have taken it out. That's what made sense to us. It didn't make sense to the state police. They were convinced I was guilty, and they sent it to a grand jury. I requested to appear at the grand jury, and they don't have to allow anybody from the defense to appear. They don't have to hear any exculpatory evidence. The prosecutor basically puts on the case that he wants to put on for the grand jurors. He'll make them think that they're in charge, but he can manipulate it if he wants to. And anybody who's been involved in criminal justice, or if you're going to be, you'll hear that you can get an indictment on a Pope, you can get an indictment on a ham sandwich, and it's really true. When I was allowed to testify, it was a party atmosphere. It was right around the holidays, and everybody had brought in plates of food. They were on a first-name basis with the state police. They were really excited to have this grand jury over with so they could have a party and then concentrate on Christmas. It was actually the second grand jury. The first one wasn't going to indict me, so they just did away with it, and they convened a second one. A couple of the men napped while I was testifying. A couple of the women were looking through a bridal magazine. The prosecutor was horrendous in yelling and screaming at me, and he did the same thing with some of the other witnesses. When I left there, I knew where it was going, and a couple days after Christmas, I was at my brother's house with my wife and my 2 young sons when I heard on a bullhorn, "Jeffrey Scott Hornoff, come out with your hands up." It was just like out of, a movie or TV. And I kissed my wife, I hugged my brother, I hugged my sons, and I went out and surrendered myself. They took me to the state police barracks with an indictment for first-degree murder. They wouldn't let me see my lawyer. They wouldn't let me have a suit and tie for court the next day. My mom put up her house, so I made bail. And we started preparing for trial with a friend of the family, my brother's friend who was an attorney, a former assistant attorney general. One huge mistake besides talking to the police was that I didn't get a private investigator and basically relied on my trial attorney. People ask me, who do I blame for my wrongful imprisonment? I blame myself. And not because I was unfaithful to my wife, because even if I hadn't have been, just knowing Vicki and being friends with her, they could have targeted me. What I blame myself for is not investigating the case myself, not looking at the crime scene photos, not delving into it as a cop, relying on somebody else to solve this problem for me. We went to trial in 1996. The murder happened in 1989. The investigation was 92 to 93, with the indictment in 93. So this was a long process. The trial took 6 weeks. The state put on, I can't tell you how many witnesses, including Dr. Henry Lee. I'm sure some of you have heard his name. He was testifying based on crime scene photographs of blood splatters. He did a better job making the jurors laugh and entertaining them than actually giving any credible evidence or testimony. The first officer on the scene said that the crime scene looked staged because the window screen was out, and that only a trained police officer would know how to stage a crime scene like that and then kill Vicki. We saw footprints going up alongside the drain pipe, and we said Vicki's killer went up the drain pipe, went in through the window, and killed her. Turned out that was true. The jury quickly disliked me because of my infidelities, and basically the prosecution only has to get a jury to dislike you. There was no evidence. Well, actually there was evidence, but it was either lost, destroyed, or never preserved in the first place. If you look at the crime scene photos, and I didn't bring my PowerPoint because I knew that Katie was giving one before me, you'll see a pair of rubber gloves turned inside out and a bandage in between the rubber gloves. Later we would see that there was blood on the inside of the rubber gloves, and the bandage looked like it had infectious seepage on it. That bandage was never, or they say it was never preserved, even though it's right next to the body. the crime scene videotape could not be presented to the jurors because the detectives who created it, they were laughing and joking about Vicky, about things that they were discovering in her apartment, and it was completely unprofessional. There were countless numbers of Warwick police officers and detectives who were trampling the crime scene. If you ever read the book about the Manson murders, Helter Skelter, where the California police just walk all over the crime scene, the Warwick police did the same thing. I was convicted of first-degree murder 6 weeks after we went to trial. And I remember Vicky's family clapping and jumping up and down when the verdict was read. My mom just gasped and fell into the pew, the bench there. I took off my wedding band and gave it to my wife. You can't have rings in prison or any jewelry. And I remember my brother saying, "You know what I know, you know what I know." We believed that the 15-year-old juvenile who had killed the mother and 2 young daughters had possibly also killed Vicky. We weren't convinced of it, but I felt he was a better suspect than me because I knew I was innocent. I was taken into the basement jail cell, strip searched, my shoelaces and belt taken away, and then transported to the prison. I was placed in protective custody because I'm a cop, and I was put in there with rapists, child molesters, snitches, juveniles, gang members, anybody who they thought would cause a problem in general population. Quite a few of them, either me or my brother, had put away. So there was a little bit of a conflict there. Everybody's tested in prison. I was too, because I was the new flavor of the week. I was all over the news. Until somebody else came in, I was the target. But there were also a few other cops in there, and we sided together. So that made it a little bit easier. It was really difficult seeing my sons come to visit. That was probably the hardest part of prison, seeing my family leave the visiting room. But I immediately started fighting. My lawyer told me that it might be a year before my appeal, and I said, "Joel, I don't think I can do a year in there." But I did. And a friend of mine started looking for different organizations to help me fight. I told my wife I wanted a divorce. I said, "There's no sense in both of us doing life. There's no sense in you staying with me. I want you to have some sort of life out there." So I insisted on the divorce. It started out amicably, but then it turned pretty bitter. I don't blame her about it. But I started fighting, and I was put in touch with the National Police Defense Foundation, which is out of Virginia. And their investigator, Boris DeKorzak, started an investigation and basically was convinced of my innocence. We filed a motion for new trial based on newly discovered evidence, not only because of his investigation, but also at this time, Craig Price, that 15-year-old juvenile, he was bragging through the air vents in segregation that he had killed Vicky and that he had put a cop in prison. So I'm feeling like Andy Dufresne from the Shawshank Redemption, thinking, there's somebody else in here bragging, I'm going to get a new trial, I'm going to be proven innocent, I'm going home. The judge summarily dismissed the motion for new trial without even holding a hearing. And they can do that. They have the power. That was another sledgehammer to the gut. My appeal, I was appointed an appellate attorney. Me, my trial attorney, and all of my family met with her, showed her all of these points of law. I was a law clerk. I was giving her as much information as I could find on case law. And she presented none of it to the Supreme Court for my appeal. My appeal was unanimously upheld by the Supreme Court, so it looked like I was going to be in prison for a while. I wrote to the New York Innocence Project. I had seen people on the Today Show, including Eddie Joe Lloyd, who had been exonerated through DNA evidence. And I was thinking to myself, those rubber gloves and that bandage, there's got to be something there. I was put in touch with the New England Innocence Project, a new startup, and I wrote them a letter, and I filled out this long application form. And as they would later tell me, Amanda Metz, one of the attorneys, she went in to Rob Feldman's office and said, "I think I got one here. It's a cop." And Rob said, "Yeah, right, like a cop convicted of murder is going to be innocent." So even he right away thought I was guilty. But they looked at the case, they came down and talked with me, and they believed me. I was the first post-conviction DNA case in Rhode Island. I had to fight very hard for the release of DNA. As I said, they couldn't find that bandage, which I thought really held the key. Our theory was that this person who had killed Vicky had peeled off the rubber gloves. There was blood on the cuff of the rubber glove and on the finger, inside fingertip. We thought that the blood on the cuff may have been Vicky's blood from the blood splatters. We were trying to be logical here, and that when he peeled them off, he got her blood on the cuff, but on the inside finger, along with that bandage, it kind of made sense if he had a cut. Also, Craig Price had cut his finger when he had killed the Heatons. He used a whole butcher block full of knives and the butcher block. And he had a really bad cut on his finger. So we were thinking there's a really good chance that it might be him. I had 3 black Muslims in prison come forward for me, a white cop. They weren't asking for a deal. They weren't asking for anything. They were just saying, he's bragging about it, this isn't right. I was really impressed by that. So we had a lot of evidence on our side. We had the rubber gloves, the fire extinguisher, something else released. And it was sent to SRI Labs, where Brian Raxall tried to test it. He said there wasn't enough DNA on the rubber gloves to test. And whatever else we had sent to him, it was the same thing. There wasn't enough at that time to do any testing. I got that news right before I had visits with family members, and it was just another empty feeling. I was pretty sure I was going to be spending the rest of my life in prison. Shortly after that, we were transferred to high security, and I was so upset that I started filing grievances against the prison, against the conditions. I filed a federal civil lawsuit by myself. I felt the repercussions. They put me in jail cells with the worst of the worst. I can't even begin to describe how bad these men were and what they did while they were in there, but it was pretty horrific. I really didn't care at this point. I wanted to make somebody else's life as miserable as mine was. So I kept filing the grievances and going forward with the federal civil suit. Right after Halloween in 2002, I was called into the lawyers inmates conference room, and I walked in there, and there was the assistant attorney general and the 2 state police detectives who had put me in prison. And my trial attorney, I walked in and I'm thinking to myself, what are they going to accuse me of now? I'd heard they were trying to clear a couple other murders by accusing me of them. And so I sat down and they asked me if I knew anybody by the last name of Barry. And I said, yeah, I know, Tom, John, and Timmy. I grew up with them. They said, no, do you know anybody by the name of Todd Barry? I said, no. And they eventually told me that he had been Vicky's boyfriend, and he had come forward and confessed to killing Vicky 13 years after her murder. And I really didn't believe it. At this point, to survive in there, you adopt a philosophy of believe it when you see it. And I really didn't believe it. I was still waiting for them to, start laughing and say April Fools or something. Even at this point, they wanted me to admit that I went to Vicky's apartment the night she was murdered, saw this horrible crime scene and did nothing, and went home and went to bed. And I said, just as I told you back in 1992 and 1993 and 1994, if it means that I'm not going to go home and see my sons, I'm not going to admit to something I didn't do. I never would have gotten parole because you have to admit to the crime, and I never would have done that. and I didn't admit to going to Vicky's apartment. I wish I had, because maybe I could have stopped it. I don't know. Maybe I would have been killed too. But Todd came forward, and they believed him, and I was brought into court a few hours later. First, I called my mom. I said, "Mom, I'm coming home." One of my biggest fears was my mom not seeing me released. And I just remember her saying, "Oh, sweet Jesus, oh, sweet Jesus." She's from West Virginia, and that's a saying I heard a lot. So I was taken into court in handcuffs and shackles. The Attorney General was there. He was okay with releasing me. My attorneys, obviously, were okay with me being released, the prosecutor too. But the judge, who I don't like him very much. Anyways, he didn't like the wording in the release, even though the New England Innocence Project attorneys had now done this a couple times. So he decided to send me back to prison. Next day was election day, and they couldn't get me into court. Courts were closed, so I had to spend 2 more days in prison. The guards felt bad for me. One brought me a bacon double cheeseburger, which was really good after all that food. And the inmates were actually pretty supportive. I had helped a lot of them as a law clerk, and I had helped other ones write letters to family members, so they were actually happy to see me being released by now. I was brought back into court, and this had given family members in West Virginia time to get up to Rhode Island. It was a huge media circus. The media is your best friend once you're declared innocent. When you're being accused of something, you're a monster. It was kind of nice having them like me, but at the same time, it got old very quickly. A lot of that is a blur. I was on the Today Show. I did an episode with Dateline, which I hope none of you ever see. It was horrible. The American Justice one was a little better. After Innocence, Mark Simon and Jessica Sanders, they did an amazing job. And I started guest lecturing. I really felt that it was my calling to try and give something back. I'd seen all these guys getting out of prison and on the Today Show, and I thought, why am I here? Kind of like when you survive a war. It's like, how did I make it out of there and so many guys haven't? There's thousands of innocent people in prison. I'm completely convinced of that. And that's why I'm here tonight, and that's why I'm going to try and keep doing this and hopefully not go back to Afghanistan, because I'd much prefer to do this, even though I think I did some good over there too. So, if anybody has any questions, since I've rambled on, yes?
So how do you feel about our justice system today?
The question is, how do I feel about our justice system or the court system? I'm still very much pro-law enforcement. I'm a cop, and I always will be. Just as I feel that the innocent should be protected, I feel that the guilty should be held accountable for their crimes. But for every innocent person in prison, there's a guilty person. Unless they've been convicted of something else, they're walking the street and they're preying on more innocent people. So I think it's really important that when you conduct an investigation, that you keep an open mind, that you don't put the blinders on. One thing that I heard when I first got on the job was that, well, if he's not guilty of this, he's guilty of something else and it's catching up to him. And that's just a horrible attitude, because then you're focusing your energies on somebody who might be innocent when the guilty person's out there hurting somebody else. Yes, sir.
Does the government pay you for your lost wages and time that you spent in jail?
The question is, does the government pay for your lost wages when you're in jail? Rhode Island doesn't have a wrongful imprisonment compensation law. I was lucky enough to be invited out to Utah, and I testified before their legislators, and they passed one. Rhode Island doesn't have one yet. I had to sue my city for my job back. I received about $600,000 in back pay. About $230,000 went to the attorneys, and the rest of it went to my ex-wife. I didn't see a dime of it. I received my retirement. They retired me immediately. Yes, sir. The question is, why did Todd Berry come forward? And I wrote him a letter, and I told him that I wanted to talk to him, and he wrote me back and he said, I'm open to meeting with you, but I want to know you know, why you want to come see me, because I've kind of melded into the woodwork here. Remember I said I was the flavor of the week? If I went in and visited with him, he would have been targeted again by the general population guys. I never wrote him back, but I have serious questions about his confession. His was videotaped, and he says on it that he got in, he went to a nightclub in Providence, Rhode Island. Somebody spiked his drink. He remembers flashes of driving on the highway, parking his car, driving up, climbing up the drain pipe and onto the roof, through Vicky's window, waking her up. She got upset because her cat went out through that window screen that he had opened up, and she started screaming that she was going to sue him, so he started beating her and choking her, and then he hit her in the head with the jewelry box and then with the fire extinguisher. It just didn't make any sense to me. A little of it did, but I think a more realistic scenario would have been that he got into an argument earlier and he went out and got some liquid courage and came back. It really doesn't matter, I guess, except for the fact that he pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he received 30 years with 15 to serve, and he's up for parole this year.
Am I wrong that wasn't there something about him waiting until his mother passed away before he was willing to confess? Right? Wasn't that the impetus?
He was waiting. He said he was waiting for his mom to pass away. I really don't know, you know, why he came forward when he did. He said he kept seeing me in the news fighting with my appeal, with the DNA testing, with the motion for new trial based on newly discovered evidence. He saw that I wasn't giving up. He didn't know it when I went to high security, high side. I had basically given up. I don't think he was going to see me in the news anymore.
So your release was based on his testimony, his letter of testimony, versus the DNA then actually? They didn't have enough to test the DNA to prove that you were innocent?
The reason for my release was not only based on his testimony. Well, it was his testimony, but he also said that he struck Vicky with the jewelry box in the neck. She had marks on her neck that measured perfectly with the legs of the jewelry box, and they were smart enough to measure it. At first they thought he was a nut, and they didn't believe him, but when that checked out...
Then they believed the story. It collaborated.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever get an apology?
The question is, did I ever get an apology? I got an apology from Todd Berry. I went to his sentencing. Actually, the Attorney General, the new Attorney General, and the prosecutor, the day I was released, they said, I probably went to Vicky's apartment the night she was murdered. It was a completely unprofessional act on my part. They were blaming me again for something I didn't do. They were just going along the party lines. The judge didn't apologize. No one apologized. Yes, sir.
What happens to the judges? I mean, if the judges are wrong and all these high-power individuals are wrong, how come they don't get punished?
The question is, what happens to the judges in these cases? Well, judges are immune from, they're immune from basically everything. They have carte blanche. They can do what they want, and he's still a judge. He's still on the bench. Yes, sir.
Two questions. What happened to you said that the cops were at the scene, you know, they were just being unprofessional. What happened to them, and why didn't you get your job back?
The first question is, what happened to the investigators, the police officers at the scene? Nothing happened to them. One of them went on to teach homicide schools. Actually, Vicky had a Rolodex, and in her Rolodex, the sixth name was Todd Berry. He was never contacted. He said if he had been contacted by either the Warwick police or the state police, he would have immediately confessed. He called the Warwick Beacon newspaper the day I was convicted. He said, "You got the wrong guy. You need to look into this." He didn't take that next step and say, "Come look at me," unfortunately. He was a carpenter, as it turned out. I'm just glad he didn't fall off a roof when he was working on one. If anything had happened to him, I'd still be in prison.
So he got a lesser crime than you did?
He had good lawyers. He took a plea deal of 30 years with 15 to serve. And the other question was about my job. I was reinstated. They immediately retired me. I really, even though I love police work, I love the part of helping people. I don't really like the cliques. There's more cliques in our police department than there are in high school. I like the police work, but I don't miss that department all that much. Yes, sir. Did you have? Oh.
Do you still live in Rhode
I
Island?
moved to Georgia about 5 years ago, and I haven't been there much either. I've spent 3 years in Afghanistan. I'm looking for a career back here in the U.S., hopefully with the Innocence Project. I even applied to this college as a member of the Public Safety Department. We'll see if they contact me. Yes.
May?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Can you tell us what tactics the police or prosecutors use to get confessions out of the innocent and guilty? And there's a part B to it, but go ahead and answer that part first.
Okay, the question is, what tactics do police officers or prosecutors use? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that police officers can trick confessions. They can lie. And they can say, your buddy in the other room is confessing to this. And if you don't own up to it, he's going to walk and you're going to do all the time for it. That's one. That's a prime example. They can tell countless things to you that aren't true. They can, unless you, what's called lawyering up, unless you lawyer up and you ask for an attorney, they can keep you there as long as they want and just keep hounding you. I stayed because I wanted them to see that I was innocent. I should have known better, being a cop, knowing the tricks, knowing what they were doing. They were doing the good cop, bad cop to me. One of them was really harsh, really severe in his questioning, calling me a dirtbag and a bunch of other names, while the other one was reaching out and touching my arm. I knew the tricks, but after a while, they still get to you. State Police Detective Deniston, he said that his job, he testified that his job was to put me in a state of suspect paranoia, which was basically to mess with my head so much that I confessed. You had another question?
And the second part of that, which maybe you've already answered, is how do you protect yourself from those tactics and techniques? And you've already mentioned lawyering up, and when somebody says you've got the right to remain silent, you better take them seriously.
The best way to protect yourself, and this is coming from a police officer, is if you ever receive a phone call from a police officer saying that they would like you to come down to headquarters to speak with them, don't go. Don't go. Call your lawyer and let your lawyer deal with them. If you don't have a lawyer, find one. And if they accuse you, find a good one. Because when they say the state of Rhode Island versus Jeffrey Scott Hornoff, it's the whole state. It's everybody. And it's all their resources. And they use it. If they want you bad enough, they're gonna go after you. Yes?
I was going to say, you said that you were already cleared at first from the murder, and then somehow they brought you back. Do you think that was more for publicity or something else?
I was cleared by my department after I took the polygraph. They cleared me way too quickly. They should have treated me as a suspect if they considered me a suspect. One of our commanders, Glenn Denning, this huge guy, he looked like a U.S. Marine drill sergeant. He wanted to treat me like a suspect. He wanted to tow my car, my personal car, into headquarters and process it. He wanted to seize my clothing. He wanted to do the job right. Everybody ignored him. And if they were going to treat me, if they were going to consider me a suspect, I really wish they had treated me as one. They did me no favors. When they went to the state police, the three detectives who did so, I told you there were cliques in the department. They hated my brother. And I inherited my brother's friends and his enemies. I don't know if they genuinely believed I was guilty or if they were swayed because of their feelings about my brother. It may have been a combination of both. maybe because they had wanted to question me and the detective captain had shut them down. Jennifer, you have a question?
No, it's just a general question, I guess, for you and me. I wonder, how you put your life back together, how you get a job, how you go on about your life. I mean, doesn't this, impact that greatly as far as trying to obtain employment?
The question is, how do you put your life back together? And I'm still trying to do that. I really felt, when I was in prison, I felt like my path when I got out, and I saw myself out, was doing this, was educating as many people as I could. I couldn't find any employment. I enrolled in a master's program and graduated from Boston University in 2006. I thought maybe being a professor was an avenue where I could further do this. I printed up a bunch of brochures and contact sheets to be a guest lecturer. I sent them out to every police department and police academy from the East Coast to Hawaii, and the only one that responded was Hawaii, and they said, what you're offering doesn't fit in with what we're teaching. Nobody else responded. I worked for a year for a friend of mine doing work from home, data implementation on the computer. That didn't last, so I got a job going over to Afghanistan and training their police, and also protecting our U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Yes?
My thing is, you had this on your record, right? But did they totally wipe it totally clean? So when you apply for jobs, I mean, it's not there? I mean, because you could go onto what, mugshots.com now?
Right.
And you can find your picture on there.
If you Google my name, you're going to get thousands of hits. And a lot of the stories from the journalists, even the ones I cooperated with, they got a lot of the facts wrong. But I'm one of the lucky ones. I was declared innocent. My record was expunged. My sentence was vacated with prejudice, which means they can never charge me again. Everything that could be done was done. I wrote to the West Virginia BCI, it's where all the fingerprints are held, and requested that they destroy them. I think they did. They said they did. The state police said they destroyed them. I'm not sure what's out there. But if anybody does a BCI check or NCIC, they won't see my name. I went over to Afghanistan and I had to have security clearance for that. I have an interim secret clearance right now. I don't know if I could get a top secret. I don't know if them seeing that I was convicted of murder would affect that. Still in people's eyes. I don't know. Yes, sir.
While you were in prison, when you heard about the 15-year-old kid that was saying that he put a cop in jail, did you ever encounter him while you were there?
Good question. The question is about Craig Price. Did I ever encounter him? Craig Price is as big as two refrigerators, one on top of the other. He's huge. And he really wanted to get a hold of me. And when I was transferred to high security, guess who was there? And I became a law clerk at high security. When I came back to the cell block mod, the guys were really surprised to see me because Craig Price had just stabbed somebody in the neck with a pencil at the law library. It must have happened seconds after I left. And maybe he thought the other guy was me. But I never encountered him, no. I'm kind of glad. Last I heard, he was transferred to a Florida prison. They violated his rights in not releasing him when he turned 18 because they wanted to keep him in because he did say he was going to kill again. And I understand why they did it, but it was still a violation of his rights. And I don't know, it probably saved a life or more. Craig Price lived in the Buttonwood section of Warwick, and what he did was he killed Mrs. Heaton and her two young daughters. They lived right behind him. He jumped the fence. They had his handprint on the glass, so he was definitely there. He sat down after killing them and had a glass of orange juice, so his fingerprints were on the glass. They had him for that one. And the crimes were so similar to the Becky Spencer murder when he was 13. It was a weapon of convenience. There was no direct evidence linking him to it, and I wasn't involved in it, so I can't positively say how they linked him other than his confession. My brother actually got his confession. They weren't going to even question him about it, but my brother had investigated Becky's murder, and the detective captain said, no, we're not going to question him, we're sending him to prison, that's it. And in front of the Attorney General, my brother said, can I go talk to him about this other murder? And the AG said, sure, why not? I don't know what my brother said to get him to confess, other than putting his arm around him while his mom and dad were in the room and saying, if you did do this, now's the time to own up to it. So I'm really not sure.